Hello everyone, it's Claire Snowden here. I'm one of the people that convenes this webinar series and co-chair of the working group on trials conduct. I'm really pleased to have Francesca Schiavone here with me today to give you a talk on trial management. And this is the first of a pair. Hello? Oh, hello, sorry, I'm not sure what that was. And this is the first of a pair of webinars, and usually we have these two linked ones to this month. So hopefully you'll enjoy this as part one, and you'll come back to join Lindsay Masters in a couple of weeks on the 25th of April for part two. So you should see Francesca's webinar as the first part of this larger, interesting picture about trial management and adaptive designs. I'm going to hand over to Francesca in a moment, but first I'll just tell you a little bit about her to give some background. She's a clinical trials manager at the MRC CTU at UCL, as a few of our other speakers have been, and some of the members of the working group have been. She previously worked on stroke trials at the NHR Southeast Stroke Research Unit as part of the core operational team there in the coordinating centre. The MRC unit in 2012 to work on an adaptive platform trial in prostate cancer, and that trial is called Stampede. Some of you may know that. She told me that that's been a really great experience, as it's involved a focus on the new complexities of clinical trials that these designs are bringing through. And she's working on a large trial with multiple research arms, which is very interesting. So in this post, she's had the opportunity to be directly involved in the core management of that trial, and is now involved in another renal trial designed in a very similar way to Stampede. But the interesting thing about that trial is that it has a future-proofing component to allow people licensing registration for the treatment being investigated. So Francesca is particularly interested in new methodologies for trial design and conduct, and especially the scientific aspects that underpin the adaptive designs, and all of the operational complexities and challenges that come with trial management. And I think we're going to hear something about those particular interests now. So I'm going to go quiet and pass over to Francesca, and then we'll come back for a few questions. So if anybody has a few questions that they would like, if you can note them and keep them for the end, we'll come back for a little question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claire. So as introduced, my name is Francesca Schiavone. I'm based at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit at UCL, and our unit is part of the Institute of Clinical Trials and Methodology. And as mentioned by Claire, I will be giving a very sort of operational presentation today, specifically about the trial management aspects of running adaptive platform trials. So let's get started. The efficiencies of adaptive platform trials have been widely recognized, and they're described in several publications, but there is very little information available out there on the informational aspects and the challenges that come with running these trials. So what I'll be doing today, I'll be sharing with you the experience that we had with from two leading adaptive platform trials run here by the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, and these are Focus4 and Stampede. In particular, I will be focusing on the operational aspects of adding a new research comparison, which is a key feature of adaptive platform trials. As some of you might know, selectively dropping arms that don't show any activity following pre-planned interim analysis is another feature of these trials, but we're not going to be focusing on this today. We're simply going to be looking at adding new research comparisons. And as mentioned by Claire, this presentation is part of part one of two, with Lindsay Masters, my colleague, presenting on the 25th of April about specifically the data management challenges that come with running adaptive platform trials. Also, we are at the very late stage of development and preparation of the manuscript, which we hope to submit very soon, and the publication hopefully will be elaborating a little bit more on the points that I'm going to present today. So starting with Stampede. Stampede is a multi-arm, multi-stage design in locally advanced metastatic prostate cancer patients. It opened in 2005 with 5 contemporaneously recruiting research comparisons and 1 shared control arm. And since 2011, we have been adding 5 new research comparisons to the existing platform, and there is one more in the pipeline for activation in the coming months, really, so quite soon. This new comparison is actually quite different from any previous one because it has a biomarker stratified comparison component. Focus 4, on the other hand, is a molecularly stratified, multi-comparison, randomized trial program for patients with colorectal cancer. The trial opened in 2014 with one molecular cohort comparison and one non-stratified comparison, but since opening in 2014, there's been 3 additional molecular cohort comparisons, and there are several others in the pipeline for opening in the near future. So the starting point for us really was to start looking at the operational components and distilling sort of these operational components required for the activation of a new research comparisons. But what some of you might find quite striking about looking at this slide is that these steps, these operational components, are not really greatly different from setting up a trial from scratch. So what we want to do during this presentation is to really focus on the challenges that we encountered when adding a new research comparisons and some of the strategies that we have and solutions that we'll come up with throughout the years. It's important to point out that the biomarker development component, it's something that constitutes a significant piece of work when it comes to adding a new research comparison. But these are not discussed, this is not very discussed in great detail during this presentation. There will be hopefully others in the future. So funding and peer review is required each time a new comparison is introduced, and traditionally in 2 arm trials, we see this step really only at the beginning of the trial. So due to the scale of the platform trials like Stampede and Focus 4, we typically see several funders around the table and several peer review bodies in consultation together. And the key strategy that we found over the years is for a more streamlined approach to peer review is to keep a constant dialogue with funders from the outset. For instance, Focus 4, for Focus 4, a trial-specific review committee was put in place by the NHR EMA program, and this was done to ensure continuity of the review and a meaningful review of the trial as a platform. In Stampede, our continuous dialogue with Cancer Research UK, which is the main funder for the trial, has led to a change in the peer review process to be adapted and to allow the selective review of a new research proposals for platform trials like Stampede. And this was a new feature of the funding application that was introduced by CR UK, and as they recognised the need to adapt the review process and the funding process in a trial environment where adaptive platform trials become more and more present. So the scale of the funding also had to be changed over the years to allow more adequate support to large platform projects. For Stampede, for instance, we just recently recruited our 10,000 patients, so we're talking about large platform trials that need adequate support. When adding a new research comparison in a platform trials like Stampede and Focus 4, there are continuous adaptations and amendments to the protocol, and these pose some challenges. We have found very important to future-proof the protocol as much as possible and to reflect on the protocol structure, as this is a key document. In particular, including plans to add new research comparisons is very important to be explicitly mentioned in the protocol so that we really set the scene about what the long-term plans are, and sites and stakeholders are aware of these plans. In Focus 4, which is the younger of the 2 trials, the team has followed a modular structure to the protocol, where there is a master protocol and different self-contained comparison-specific sections. And this approach has really allowed more flexibility in the implementation of the trial because, for example, not all centres might participate toward research comparisons, so having a modular structure would really help. Stampede, on the other hand, has used a more traditional approach to protocol structure with one single document. And we're not necessarily saying here to follow one approach or the other. There are merits and benefits in both of these approaches, but we just want to emphasize the importance of really thinking about protocol structure and the longevity of the trials. It's also very important to really get key terminology right from the beginning to ensure that all stakeholders really understand that we're talking about one trial. The multi-comparison aspect could distract stakeholders and these sites and regulators to think that we're not talking about one trial. So it's important to frame this right from the very beginning. Now, the benefits and efficiencies of adding a new research comparisons to an ongoing platform become really apparent when it comes to regulatory approval, at least in the UK. So in the UK, the addition of a new research comparison can be implemented with a substantial amendment, which requires 35 days as approval window, so which is a much shorter timeline compared to the approval that is required for starting a trial from scratch, which is typically 60 days. Now, bearing this in mind, we still need a word of caution about sort of the magnitude and changes that are required to trial documentation, the protocol, the patient information sheet, the consent form, that are necessary to activate a new research comparison, even if the timelines for regulatory and HRA approval are much shorter. So the approval also relies on an understanding from the regulators of what the trial design is all about. And this is why we, Focus 4 and Stampede alike, have always had a discussion with the MHRA prior to adding a new research comparison. This was absolutely invaluable for the trial teams. Interestingly, some of you might have noticed that the MHRA website has been updated recently with a little notification to encourage investigators to get in touch with the MHRA clinical trials team early on when planning to submit an amendment concerning an adaptive platform trials. And this, I think, is an important change in the regulatory landscape, as it really demonstrates that regulators are aware and responsive to this type of trials being used more and more. Obviously, you need to be aware that when adding a new research comparison, we're always also involving different pharmaceutical companies, different industry partners for educational grants, for drug supply, and naturally this collaboration needs to be sealed with contracts, and negotiations are often very time-consuming and can be a rate-limiting step. So you need to be aware of this as an important factor, and you need to plan it into your project plan. Something else to mention is you have to be aware of that there might be a need for drug supply, for example, or to allocate a bid for a biomarker lab, that an EU tender might be required. And these have fairly long, prolonged timelines that can go up to 90 days from submission to completion. So you need to factor that in. And as you might expect, drug supply will be dependent on contract sign-off, and therefore you need to be very aware of these timelines from the very beginning. There are specific challenges to data management for the updates of case report forms and the development and update of database, but as I said at the beginning, Lindsay Masters will be covering extensively on these challenges on the 25th of April, so I'll encourage you to dial in for the second part of this presentation looking at data management. Another key area of efficiencies is when it comes to site implementation. So the challenge that we have here is that we have to activate a new comparison across a large number of sites while the platform is ongoing. So it could be a very intense period of activity for sites and clinical trials team, the teams of the clinical trials unit. So the first step that we have identified over the years is to really involve the teams at site from the very early stages of the development of the idea generation for a new comparison. And we've done this with surveys. But we continue this engagement with a quite intensive site training site training program leading up to the time of the launch of a new comparison. Both Focus 4 and Stampede have used a risk-based approach in relation to site setup. And generally the approach is to have a set activation date that acts as a deadline for sites to bear in mind so that all activation steps can be completed by that time. And an important consideration that is intrinsic to the trial design is whether to stop randomization or continue randomization across all other existing comparisons if a site is not ready to activate a new one. So Stampede has a shared control arm, as highlighted at the beginning, and this means that sites that are not ready to activate a new comparison will need to be temporarily suspended from randomizing patients across the whole trial and only reactivated once all the activation steps have been met. This has been a successful model that's been used so far in Stampede, and unfortunately the only model that can be used because of the control arm being shared across all research comparisons, old and new. Focus 4 allows the registration and randomization to other comparisons, even if there are delays to the implementation of a new one. And this is because each cohort has its own set of control arm. It's a very intense sort of workload for sites and CTUs alike. So it's something to bear in mind. But an example of when the design really signs up pays off is presented here. So this graph is looking at the time it takes to each site to recruit the first patient, and is comparing in Stampede the original comparison, which is the line at the bottom, the teal line at the bottom, against all the other comparisons that have been added over the years since 2011. So as you can see, it takes about 9 years for about 120 centers to recruit and randomize their first patient. Whereas in the abiraterone comparison, which is the orange line you see right at the top, this has been achieved in 24 months. So naturally, when you start a new trial, it takes time to set up all sites, and this is reflected in the time to recruit their first patient, as you can see in the original comparison. And this is reiterated in the second diagram here, where you can see the time it takes to sites to randomize sort of the first 3 patients. So it's a very efficient model to see recruitment speeding up over time. Now, there are some specific challenges that are really posed to the trial management team at the CTU when running these trials. As been mentioned before, there is an intense workload at the time sort of leading up to a new comparison being added, and there's always a balance between sort of working with conflicting tasks. But trials for Stampede and Focus 4 here at the CTU are fairly large, and we have several trial managers and data managers working on the trials. Traditionally, for a 2-arm trial, you will see a model where you have 1 trial manager and 1 data manager. So the team structure really had to adapt and change over time to make sure that these trials could be conducted appropriately. But obviously, bigger teams mean that you require a little bit more consideration on how the work is split, and there are different ways to go about it. It could be by comparison or by specific tasks, and it's really just trying to balance this against also the development requirements for each sort of team member. You need to bear in mind that it's always about proactive oversight and very careful research planning to ensure that you can deliver these trials. So, for example, the changes in the standard of care and the control arm followed a primary analysis in Stampede meant that we had to change the protocol. And this naturally sort of delayed the activation of the metformin comparison. So this is something that sort of, it's about prioritizing tasks and really see what the trial throws at you. Similarly, the abiraterone and enzalutamide comparison closed the recruitment in 2016 because we reached its recruitment target. And the metformin comparison, which was the new comparison in the pipeline, really only opened until sort of September 2016. That meant that Stampede, for a period of about 6 months, was really only open to a subset of patients, and because only the M1RT comparisons was open to newly diagnosed metastatic patients. And similarly, Focus 4 had to stop recruitment to Focus 4D, one of the cohort comparisons, following activity stage analysis. And it was a few weeks before, and this was a few weeks after opening Focus 4B. So timelines could be really fast-paced. We have learned some lessons over the years, sometimes in the hard way. The first one is the importance of having an unstratified component when you're working at a biomarker stratified trial like Focus 4. And this is because it opens really the trial to those patients that are not biomarker positive and includes more patients and opens the possibility to be part of the trial. It's absolutely paramount to have a very strong collaborative trial management group. Both trials have one chief investigator, but each of the research comparisons are led by a lead investigator, a clinician that leads specifically on the scientific question being posed by the new comparison. So it really, really feeds onto the capacity building within the trial management group. It's absolutely important that the NHR regional networks, clinical research networks, understand and design and the implementation process for the addition of a new research comparisons, and they've been absolutely vital for the success of both trials. As mentioned at the beginning, thinking about the protocol structure and thinking about the terminologies is also important, and there are absolute huge amount of benefits in having one regulatory and ethics approval system, the benefit of being under one clinical trial authorization, but also you have to bear in mind that the governance landscape changes all the time. Both Stampede and Focus 4 have seen the change from CSP to the new HRA system, and you need to keep on top of these changes. If we could do it again, perhaps we would set up sites with a more phased approach, just to manage the work in a little bit more pragmatic way. But as we said at the beginning, it's important to really think about having adequate central resources for the trial management team to make sure these trials can run as smoothly as possible. Always bear in mind the negotiations with the pharmaceutical company and contract teams can take a huge amount of time, so don't dismiss those. And as always, science moves really fast, and as trial teams, you need to keep on top of this sort of ever-changing in science and how the trial can adapt quickly to these changes. There are still many questions that need to be answered. It will be really interesting to see how sites, what sites think about adaptive trials and whether the broad efficiencies of these trials can really be appreciated by sites. It will be good to have their input. It will be interesting to see whether we can develop a gold standard for resourcing adaptive trials. It's still a fairly uncharted territory. And really will be interesting from a methodological point of view to see how we can measure operational efficiencies in trial conduct, particularly in adaptive platform trials. Just to conclude, I hope we sort of demonstrated there are a number of efficiencies linked to this trial design, but there are operational challenges that need to be sort of kept in mind. We think these challenges can be overcome, but we encourage everyone and all trialists to consider this trial design and while being very mindful of the challenges ahead. And as I said, we have a publication in the pipeline that hopefully will be out soon. And finally, I would like to thank the co-authors of the paper that we're working on and fellow trial managers and trial management teams, the Focus 4 and Stampede Trial Management Group, and the sponsor, obviously, the Medical Research Council, the funders, and industry partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That was really interesting and a really nice start to this pair of papers. You've raised some useful questions towards the end, and maybe we can use the time when we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions to start exploring some of those. You mentioned a couple of times that there were challenges for some of the sites that were involved in the trials, but also benefits from the sites. Do you have any handle on how the sites reacted to the approaches you were taking in these trials and the demands on them?
I think when it comes particularly to Stampede, which is sort of the trial that's been going on for sort of the longest time, we think the response from site has been really good, and there's always been enthusiasm to support the study. And I think this is demonstrated in how successful the recruitment has been. It's kind of the design, it really serves the interesting questions, scientific questions, clinical questions that have emerged over the years. So we think sites are really positively engaging with Stampede and with Focus 4, although the different challenges when it comes to biomarker stratified protocols. There is obviously a potential challenge that comes with having a lot of patients and the workload that comes with it. Every time that we survey sites for a new comparison, there is a positive engagement, both from the clinicians, but also from the teams, the research teams, the nurses, the pharmacists. But it will be interesting to explore this more and perhaps doing it in a more systematic way.
Yeah. Maybe you need a nice piece of qualitative research that will explore people's views in depth. That would be good. Yeah. We've got a couple of questions. We've got one that's written, and I think Claire Upton is going to speak to us in a minute and ask her question. So if you can remember, everyone, if you've got a microphone, you can put a question to us. But firstly, I want to go to Sarah Pearson's question, which was about how easy it was, or how easy was it to agree sponsorship?
Sponsorship was, in a way, probably the easiest of things that we had to deal with, and this is because these trials are designed by the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, and at the time we were part of the Medical Research Council. Therefore, both trials are sponsored by the Medical Research Council. It's important to bear in mind these are academically led studies, so the sponsorship really was never really in question. Even if there is a wide collaboration with industry partners, the sponsorship wasn't really a complexity that we had to deal with. The sponsor was the MRC. The trials are designed and run by the MRC CTU, and in many respects the collaboration with the industry was very clear from the outset about where that role and responsibility lied. So I think it was very positive. It hasn't been challenging. And I have to say it hasn't been challenging for other adaptive platform trials that we are setting up here at the CTU, although under a different sponsorship, UCL, as now we're part of the university.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's interesting to know that sort of reputation carries quite a lot. We've got a question we'll turn to first to Claire, who's going to speak, I think, and then we have another couple of questions which I'll read out to you. Claire, would you like to put your question?
Oh, can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, I've actually just typed it, just saying. So thank you, Francesca. Really interesting presentation. Do you know if any researchers are using platform trials for testing non-pharmaceutical interventions?
We definitely have done in Stampede with the M1-RT comparison. So this was a research idea that was proposed by one of our TMG members, Chris Parker, based on the Royal Marsden. It was to look at radiotherapy, the benefit potentially to overall survival of administering radiotherapy to newly diagnosed metastatic patients. So in that respect, there was no collaboration required with an industry partner, and there was no pharmaceutical sort of element to it. The treatment was radiotherapy. Now, worth bearing in mind that because the trial as a whole is a CTIMP, we still had to go through MHRA approval, even though it's not an IMP. Radiotherapy is not an investigational medicinal product. But it also meant that we could set up the comparisons without necessarily having industry on board. So it was a fully academic question in that respect.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Do you know of any other examples of people setting up platform trials for testing non-pharmaceutical interventions?
I am not aware myself of any other trials, non-CTIMs using adaptive trials, but adaptive platform trials. But I could definitely look into it and get back to you.
Oh, thank you. All right, cheers, Francesca.
No problem.
Lovely, thank you. Stein Ahmed says, how closely involved are industry partners in the running of these trials, Francesca?
the trials are run by the CTU, so that means that any aspects of trial management and data management is defined by the CTU here at UCL. There is obviously a collaboration and dialogue with each industry partner in terms of, for example, safety events or safety reporting that might need for their specific IMP that might need to be required. But this is something that is always outlined in the contracts at the very beginning and is negotiated. So there's no, at least for Stampede or Focus 4, there is no clinical research organization, for example, that is involved in the management of the trial or any other aspect of trial management being monitoring or anything else that's really led by the pharmaceutical companies. It's a 100% academically led trial. Obviously, well, not obviously perhaps, but the pharmaceutical companies do provide drug free of charge, but this is all set up by contracts. But even the drug supply management is handled here by the MRC Clinical Trials Unit. And I'm not sure, but Lindsay might be able also to comment in a couple of weeks' time about the drug supply management system that we put in place for these trials, and we developed in-house. So we're using academic systems, if you like.
Thank you, Francesca. I'm going to go back to another question from Sarah Pearson, and then Danielle Johnson would like to speak, and we'll see where we are then. Francesca's question goes back a little bit to thinking about the sites as we were at first. She says, funder and MHRA discussions have clearly been important in the acceptance and delivery of the trial. How has the model or design been received at local site level for NHS R&D approval?
Has been really positive. We found that sort of providing as much information as possible to the R&Ds and the local teams as early as possible about an upcoming comparison is very important. We looked at, in Stampede, I can't necessarily comment for Focus 4, but we looked at the time to local approval from basically giving out an information pack to local approval, and about 75% of the sites, having been given about 6 to 7 weeks notice, are able to accommodate the trial and approve the trials. It's been very successful, but this has come with a lot of discussion and communication with sites. So it's been very positive in Stampede, but obviously they had to be balanced out with a lot of communication and very clear implementation plans being disclosed to R&D and to local sites about what's required.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, sorry, someone did try and speak still.
No, it was me apologising for talking over you.
Okay, no worries. So if we turn to Danielle Johnson now, she'd like to speak. Hi, Danielle, are you there still?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You're a little bit quiet, but we can hear you.
Hi, Fran. I'm just wondering how the biomarker stratified arm of Stampede, how the setting up of that has been different compared to the other arms, and when can you expect it to actually start?
Hello, Danielle. It's been quite different as far as I understand it, in the sense that obviously the biomarker sort of discovery element was sort of a big driver. I think the discussion with the industry partner has been fairly lengthy. I can't necessarily comment about how different it has been. Obviously, we had a good example from an experience from Focus 4 that we could sort of so we can sort of pinch their ideas and then try to see how some challenges could be overcome from them, since they were quite experienced. As far as I'm aware, the stratified comparison is going to be up and running in the next couple of months. But I'm sure the Stampede team will be able to comment a little bit more about when it's due to be set up. But as far as I understand, in the next couple of months, we'll be up and running.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. We've got a few questions that have built up in the Q&A, so brace yourself, Francesca, sorry. But it's really good that it's producing some nice discussion. To go back to Ian Emerson, who put one of our early questions, he asks, could I ask how large the trial team was that delivered the Stampede trial?
When we started in 2005, and I wasn't born yet, but there was I think a fairly traditional setup. So there was one trial manager and two data managers. As the trial grew, we had the addition of at least two trial managers at some point after the introduction of the abiraterone comparisons, and about 2 to 3 data managers. At the moment, I believe we're running to 5 trial managers and perhaps 8 or 9 data managers, but I'm not sure about what the proportional full-time equivalent and part-time equivalent would be. So it's one of the largest, if not the largest, trial team in the unit, and has grown as the trial has grown. But as I said during the presentation, this is to balance off the 10,000 patients that have been recruited over the years. So there are a lot of tasks and demands generally that come from the trial. So we started off with 1 trial manager and 2 data managers, and now we're working to 5 trial managers and several data managers. It's changed quite a lot.
Gosh, that is quite a change. Sam Hinsley's got a really interesting question, and you may, Francesca, want to go back to the slide that's being mentioned in the question. So in the figures showing the speed of recruiting the first patient, it looked as though the most recently added comparison isn't recruiting as well as the others. Why do you think that is? And is it the randomization between all studies? Sorry, is the randomization between all studies?
So
was that clear?
Yeah, I think I get the second part. So the transdermal estriol comparison is a comparison has been added last year in June, and it has a subset of inclusion criteria that are fairly stringent. So these patients, as far as I understand, they can't have exposure to anti-androgen therapy for the same length as the rest of the cohort of STAMPEDE. So that means they can only have less of anti-androgens before being randomized. Typically, it's a lot harder to find these patients because the moment a patient is diagnosed with prostate cancer, that the first line therapy and the standard of care is to give them a little boost of anti-androgens before starting them on long-term hormone therapy. So it's the patient selection that is a little bit more complicated for this cohort of patients. So it's just a little bit more challenging. And the second question was it about the shared control arm, or am I making it up?
Sorry, I've just got to go back to the question. Hang on, let me scroll to it. It said, is the randomization between all studies, was the second part of the question.
Yes, so basically there is one, so the randomization, the inclusion criteria, there is a set of broad inclusion criteria that are applicable to all comparisons, so across the whole study. And then there is a subset of eligibility criteria for each comparison. So for example, the metformin comparison requires the patient not to be diabetic already. So any patient that is screened that turns out to be diabetic will be basically excluded from randomizations to the metformin comparisons, but could still be eligible to the rest of the comparisons open at each given time. But there is sort of one randomization system, if that was sort of answers the question.
Thank you. We've got a question from Aristoteles Diplas. What is the role of QA, if any, prior, during, and post implementation?
Of quality assurance.
Yeah, quality assurance.
There is a huge element of quality assurance, but this is before, during, and after. So the challenge that is brought by trials of this scale is also the fact that as the trial changes and adapts, there's a change in risk that needs to be assessed. So we have a fairly stringent review system here within the CTU where our quality management plans and monitoring plans, our risk assessment and our pharmacovigilance processes are reviewed at least yearly, but also every time a research comparison is added. And this is to make sure that we are adapting our system and processes to make sure there is quality assurance. So it plays a big part. I think it probably deserves a seminar on its own, but we have these systems in place here at the CTU. Not sure if I don't think this is necessarily an exhaustive answer, but hopefully covers the basics.
Lovely, thank you. Alini Frangu asks a question which I think you have already covered, but I just want to make sure so it's not missed, but also to let you know that she says thank you for a very interesting talk. She's asking how many statisticians were on the trial and how many are currently working on it. And I think you have said that, so I can just be a quick number if you like.
So we have a different level of sort of statistical involvement. Our project lead is the senior statistician. The program lead, Max Palma, is also involved, but this is a part of the sort of design part of the trial, and each time a comparison. But on a day-to-day basis, we have 2 statisticians. We used to be 1 until a couple of years ago, but we've now upgraded to 2 full-time equivalent statisticians.
Thank you. We've got a nice question from Claire Brooks. She says, would you say that negotiating contractual agreements with industry partners is harder in the MAMS design than in non-adaptive trials, or does each company have to only agree to clauses relevant to the arm that they're involved in, which obviously would simplify things?
So that's a very interesting question. So that the agreements and the contracts are with the companies are really only relevant to their own comparison. So for instance, the abiraterone comparisons, we had a collaboration, we still have a collaboration with Janssen, and the collaboration agreement was really specifically only about that comparison. Interestingly, we also had a collaboration with the abiraterone and enzalutamide comparison, which is later on in July, starting in July 2014. We had 2 potentially competing pharmaceutical companies using 2 very similar compounds or complementary compounds, enzalutamide and abiraterone. And we had to have 2 separate sets of agreements with them, but obviously they didn't need to have a reciprocal agreement with each other. It's us as a sponsor. But it's complex. The complexity comes to play because you have to have the contracts in place before anything else really can start, and you have funding agreed and the drug is available. So the time is what brings a challenge, but in itself, contracts are just as complex as non-adaptive trials.
Okay. We still have a few more questions. If you're happy to keep on answering, Francesca. Sorry, you've been needing a glass of water.
No,
it's great. It's a lot of interest. Joseph Collins asked a question that I find very interesting, which is about the detail in the patient information sheets. What detail do you go into with regards to the complexities of the trial?
So the patient information sheet, and I'm specifically talking about St. because that's the trial that I have most experience on. We originally started in a fairly simple format where all treatments were described within the same, and the risks and benefits were described in the same document. As the trial sort of grew larger and larger, and as we had more comparisons recruiting contemporaneously, we decided to sort of split up those patient information sheets. So there is a main one introducing the trial as a whole, and then specific treatment-specific ones that looked at the risks and benefits in detail. What's very important, it's something that we have definitely incorporated in Rampart, which is the renal trial that I'm working on at the moment, using the same multi-arm, multi-stage design, is to make very clear at the beginning that given the nature of the trial, comparisons could be dropped following an interim analysis. Patients need to be ready to have this understanding that at some point, because of pre-planned statistical analysis, if the treatment is shown not to be safe or active, there could be the treatment could be dropped, and therefore they might be asked to stop taking their drug. And this happened with the celecoxib comparison, which is not mentioned at all during this during this presentation, but it had to be stopped in 2011, I believe, as an activity stage 2 analysis was run, and basically celecoxib was not shown to be active. So the patient information sheet is vital to communicate the fact that these trials change all the time, and therefore patients might be asked to make some changes to their treatment.
Yes, I can see that understanding that from the start is really important if there's a sudden change.
This is also why we have patient representatives as part of our trial management group, and they've been fantastic and absolutely vital in developing the patient information sheet and discussing the complexity of the trials from a patient perspective, so that we could develop adequate information sheets. So it's been really good.
Yeah. We've got Linda Collins being prepared to talk. She must have a microphone. That's really nice. So if Linda's still available, Linda, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Yes. My question is with regards to sort of setting up the protocol. I like the idea of the modular system whereby I guess you have the main protocol and then you add on the extra bits depending on the arms. How easy is it to set up that initial protocol? My understanding from the MHRA is that you have to be very, very careful what you put in that protocol because although this is an adaptive trial, so by the nature you're going to be adding in different arms, you have to effectively say up front what you are likely to be putting into that trial. Has that been your experience when dealing with the MHRA?
So I believe for Focus Board that has definitely been their experience. They had to have an informal but advisory conversation with the MHRA at the beginning when the trial program started as a whole, because at the beginning they were open, they knew they were opening one stratified and one non-stratified component, but they had a number of other cohorts that had lined up that they weren't ready to activate from the outset, but they knew they were coming up. So that conversation with the MHRA meant that the MHRA was informed about what was coming up and also could see the trial evolving in the future. With Stampede, we don't necessarily have, so when Stampede started, it started as a multi-arm trial with the 5 comparisons, but we didn't necessarily have visibility in the future about what arm specifically, or what comparison specifically we were going to add. And this why was important when we had the understanding of the first comparison, first new comparisons being added, the Abiraterone one 2011, that's when we brought, we came together with the MHRA to discuss about the upcoming change and to really see how that fits within the clinical trial authorization that was given for the trial at the beginning. And every time we have a new arm coming up, so that's true for all the arms, including the ones that are not directly under the remit of the MHRA, like the radiotherapy one, we have a conversation with the clinical trials team at the MHRA to explain what the changes coming up are and to really have their advice across the board, and not just about the protocol, but for example, safety monitoring, which is obviously something that the MHRA cares quite a lot about.
That's great. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Lovely, thank you. Sorry, my chat box is just stuck, and got it. Sorry, I couldn't get back to it. There's a question that Shanaz Moet has been waiting to ask for a little while. For such a large trial, the unit has it addressed excess treatment costs directly with NHS England when new arms are added at a national level, or does it leave it to the individual sites?
So, as part of the peer review system, CRUK and the NHR do ask to provide an overview about the research costs, but also service support costs and excess treatment costs. These are then presented after peer review approval to each individual trust. They're not individually negotiated, but they are presented as a model, as you would do now under the new HRA system, having a schedule of events where you present the sort of research costs and service support costs and excess treatment costs. But these are not individually negotiated with NHS England.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to one last question now. I know there are a few people who've asked 2 or 3 questions, but I've tried to at least get to everyone. So I apologise if I've made a mistake and there's one that's been missed, other than a second or third question. But we're getting pushed for time now. Sharon Alenda says, thank you for the presentation, it was very interesting. Please could I ask, how are the trials and comparisons monitored? Do you monitor the trial as a whole or each comparator?
We monitor the trial as a whole, and we have a risk-based approach to our monitoring. So patients are monitored as part of the trial, not at the individual comparison-specific level.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Francesca. I think you can see from the amount of questions, which I don't think we've ever had this many questions in a webinar before, you've obviously sort of given a presentation that really touches people's interests, and there's a sort of a keenness to learn more about this sort of approach and the complexities that it raises. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I hope I've addressed the questions as best as I could. But
I think that you've given so many questions, you did really well. Thank you. And if you would like to come back for part 2 for Lindsay Masters' webinar on the 25th of April, it's not long to wait. That would be really great. And both will be available on our webinar page as recordings if you want to listen to them immediately next to each other. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for your patience, all you questioners who had to wait a while for us to get round them. And thank you for your attendance. Goodbye.
Thank you.